Hi, everyone. This is Matthew Ehret.
Hello.
He publishes on CanadianPatriot.org and RisingTideFoundation.net.
Correct. Yes.
Great. And this podcast is about ideologies. It's named the Dogs and Baskets podcast, which is an inside joke within the Ultimate Frisbee community. Ultimate Frisbee has been around for almost 53 years now. It's been played by millions. There's been three, at least, professional leagues attempted. There's one of those is still in action. And ultimate players crave recognition and respect, and they have. I've been playing since the 70s. And yet every time, 9 times out of 10, when we tell someone we play Ultimate Frisbee, we get one of two questions. Oh, is that the game with the dog, or is that the things we see with the kids playing with baskets down in the park? And so simultaneously, ultimate players crave, they're I think ultimate players are probably the most fanatical, athletes out there, and they crave recognition, and yet it's my estimation, it's the ideology behind the sport that's preventing them from getting what they want. And so this podcast is quasi about ultimate frisbee, but on a larger scale, it's on ideologies. And I've been beating my head against the wall for 40 years in this damn sport, not really understanding, what I was confronted it. Why couldn't, I've developed a lot of innovations that never got taken up in the game. The game has been very stale and it doesn't evolve. Of course, I'm going to get yelled at by a lot of ultimate frisbee players, but compared to where I've taken the sport, it's been played the same for 40 years. Teams are still running drills now that they are running in 1979. And so, and I never really understood ideologies, not that I understand them now, but I never really understood them at all until the last couple of years with a lot of the stuff that's going on in society. And Matthew has written some very interesting articles about epistemology, which I believe it's a major contributing factor to different ideologies, and he's written about ideologies as well. So I thought I'd have him on to talk about ideologies, and his wealth of knowledge is incredible. So you want to just start talking about ideologies and what you think they are?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And thank you, Frank, for having me on. Your work has been really interesting. I've had a chance to watch a few of your videos, your documentaries, and it's a good service that you're doing to try to uplift people's way of thinking at a time when I mean, the premium on ideas in a time of crisis is so high, and it's so needed. Because I mean, I think we're part of the reason why we face this crisis. And I think when you look at history, and I'm a bit of a historian myself, I've written a few books on history, specifically from a Canadian angle on the Untold History of Canada book series. But I try to cusp it within a concept of universal history. And whenever I look at that, the crisis points that humanity reaches at various moments when you have a collapse of that society, whether it's the Roman Empire or whether it's the period of the Little Dark Ages in Europe in the 14th century, there's always a crisis of sense perception where people start believing too much in their senses, their minds, what they can conceptualize as far as their identities, their idea of how they relate to the past and the future and a greater whole that's beyond their empirical data. Whenever they lose that ability to do that, and they start believing too much in their senses, you have a great crisis in creative solutions. There's an inability for people to generate concepts that are necessary to overcome the problems, and there's obviously a variety of types of problems that could only be solved that way. So I think that by helping people to see with their mind's eye instead of their eyes alone is vital. So the topic of ideologies, what you're always trying to do, I've noticed in your videos, is to help people see with their mind's eye, which is a transcendental mode of seeing that is necessary to help us tap into resources that we have within ourselves that we didn't even realize we had until we learned how to do that. That's vital. So from the standpoint of, I think the thing that started our conversation some time ago was on an article that I wrote on the epistemology or the geopolitics of epistemological warfare. And it was a little article that you really enjoyed. And the reason why I did that was to give people a sense that if you want to understand, a lot of people have political, geopolitical opinions about things. They try to, obviously, we're all trying to make sense of the world we live in. There's a lack of appreciation for because geopolitics is the politics shaped by the limits of the geo, right? The earth that we're on. And that's sort of, there's a certain science of limits of powers, great powers using the limits to resources to get other targets to fight each other. And it's not just that we have this physical environment that we're born into that we adapt to, which is how this game is often played, to play people against each other. That's how empires work, right? You divide to conquer, you get people to fight over resources, whatever else, territorial issues. But there's a higher environment that we have to be sensitive to, which is an environment of ideas, that there's sets of thoughts, sets of ideologies that saturate our world. And it's invisible to the eyes, but it's even more real in many ways than the physical world that we live in. Because it's these ideologies, the ones that we either knowingly or in many cases, we're not even aware of what ideological assumptions or axioms charge and shape our convictions and our identities that result in a predictable mode of behavioral responses that we might have to various stimulation, right, in various circumstances. If we're not aware of that, we're not really in charge of our own destiny. We're always going to be, we might think we are, we might think we have a democracy, but we don't really. So by becoming aware of some of these key ideologies, is what I tried to do in this paper, where I showcased, some case studies like Adam Smith, free trade. Where did he come from? Where did that ideology come from? Because it's influential. People shape their world around that, the assumptions being true, embedded within the free trade system. But did Adam Smith believe it himself? Not. I maybe he did, but I know one thing's for sure is there's evidence, a lot of evidence, that he was assigned the role of creating the Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, from the head of British intelligence, who was not very concerned with finding a new system of political economy to make the world better. It was entirely a geopolitical maneuver. And then I go through some other case studies. So that's the way I try to approach it.
So when I look at society right now, I see the ism schism. We have a schizophrenic society, and I know I'm going to get some blowback on all this, but we have Catholicism and atheism and scientism and wokeism and communism and socialism. And when you look at, and the definition of the word ideology is not really a dictionary definition. It's much more philosophical. It's an encyclopedia kind of definition, which is why partially I wanted to have you on here to explain sort of the pedigree of the word. And when I look at I look at Wikipedia for what it is. It's very fluid, as we know, and it's very ideological. And so the definition that they use over the years I've been tracking it has been moving around. It used to say something about normative behavior, which is actually quite true. Ideologies, well, you're supposed to behave this way, you're supposed to think this way. But now it says something about a belief system that's not always entirely rational, based on an epistemic model. In other words, in religions we have beliefs. In science we have a priori presupposition, which is the same, which is Latin for belief. And so within every ideology, there's an underlying assumption, belief, a priori presupposition, something there that's not entirely rational. We could look at postmodern science, for example, and look at how they've assumed scientific materialism, that we can figure out anything through a materialistic viewpoint or paradigm. But really what makes postmodern science ideological is something called hypothetico-deductivism, which has created a form of science that's a form of institutionalized atheism. And whether or not there is or there is not a God, science shouldn't predetermine an answer to a question that nobody knows the answer to. And so that's where you've got the little bit of epistemic leap of faith within science. And of course, you've got that with religions and an ultimate frisbee, and which I like to use ultimate frisbee as a case study because how benign, it's a sport, it's a game. We can look at it objectively and say, well, look, here's what's happening and here's what it is. Here's the results. And in communism and socialism, of course, they have all these ideologies that are based on assumptions that usually are fairly easy to knock down.
Yeah, I would actually ask you a question on that because I find it provocative that you're using the case study of ultimate frisbee to introduce this more grandiose concept. But in what way is it, if you don't mind me asking you a question here, in what way do you see ideology expressing itself in ultimate frisbee? Because I could see rules. I mean, obviously rules have certain assumptions about how things should work within a game, within a system, and obviously I could see in my mind's eye how any game, including ultimate frisbee, has rules and assumptions. But is there more to it than that, as far as you're thinking about it, or is that the simple?
It's far more. Yeah,
Okay.
I would love to. I don't know if we have the time today. I don't know what kind of curfew you're on. I would love to actually, with you or someone else, go through the first three paragraphs of the rules. Um, line by line, and just ask you, look, is this ideological? Is this, what is this? Okay. What's the assumption? But I will tell you, within the first three paragraphs of the rules for ultimate frisbee, we have identity politics, virtue signaling, egalitarianism, equality of outcome, equity, diversity, inclusion, the whole thing. And when you hear all of those qualities, what kind of ideology does that sound like to you?
Okay, interesting. I never thought about that way. That's okay. So I guess to follow up on what you're saying, I think that one of the problem with the isms approach that contaminates a lot of our society is everyone wants to find a formula to make sense of things. And the problem with formulas are useful, okay? Like, it's great that animals don't do formulas, they don't do symbolism, they don't discover invisible laws, organizing processes that they are born into. They adapt according to genetic and environmental constraints, or demands, and that's great. And that's where their destiny is sort of confined to. They don't discover those laws, find ways of getting concepts that they then put in a communicable symbol that they can then get into another mind that then will allow people to conform their behavior to higher discoverable concepts. They don't do that. Humans do that. So there's a good and a bad side that comes with that. So when you have a formula, yes, all of a sudden it has applicability. Life can be made better by discovering geometrical truths, mathematical truths that give you insights and abilities to harness forces of nature that might have otherwise, when you're ignorant of them, they're dominating you. You have no influence over them, and that's great. You can have more people at a higher quality of life when you can harness things like electricity, for example. The more you understand it, the better it serves you. However, when you make the trap of allowing the formula to carry more weight than it deserves, you often people want the formula to replace their own active thought. So they stop thinking because now they have something that can think for them. This formula says that A equals B, B equals C, A equals C, and that works. But the thing, then, this is why it's so wonderful to look at people like Plato, for example. I'm really attracted, and I find a lot of value in reading a lot of the Platonic dialogues, because within the concept, within the substance of these dialogues, it's very process oriented. Plato is trying to, in various ways, always get you to think about thinking. The point of the dialogues is never really the literal topic, whether it's justice or what is virtue or what is courage or what is fidelity. That's a kickstarter, an icebreaker to get a dialogue going. But the point is to start learning, how do we examine our own assumptions, and how do we generate, when we discover that the assumption of how we thought something doesn't match up to reality. Hence, the character of Socrates, right, is always bringing people to a paradox, an ontological paradox of, like, okay, if you think that, justice is the will of the strong to suppress the weak, if that's your view of it, let's see where it goes. And he'll then bring the person through a series of a dialectic process to a paradox, which, cause the person to then either leave in a rage, which sometimes happens in the dialogues, or reevaluate their assumption and generate a new hypothesis which is superior to the old one. And it's that process of self-reflexively self-examining and purifying our thoughts according to a better attunement with reality that only occurs when you have a certain attitude to things, because it's not purely intellectual. That's when you could start liberating, I think, yourself from an an adherence to formulaic approaches to things. Because it's not, the formulas are useful, but you're always thinking, okay, how do I make, what is it within the formula that I'm using, which is preventing me from discovering something even better? And you're always then looking at the root assumption.
I always like to look at isms as training wheels, right? You know, training wheels, you put them on and you can learn how to ride a bike, but at some point they become more of a hindrance than they are, you know, a learning aid. And so what Socrates did is help people take off their training wheels. And I love the allegory of the cave. I've always had this, well, not always, very recently had this idea of a Oculus-based virtual reality experience of Plato's cave using Oculus. But every time you turn your head, you're in a different ideology. And what you ultimately realize is that the entrance to the cave is in the center of your mind.
That's a fun experiment. That would definitely be a fun experiment. But yeah, I mean, and definitely the way to always break out is to start thinking about, like Socrates says, you know, you have to know yourself. And if you don't know yourself, you shouldn't be trying to go, like, as he talks to Alcibiades, you know, or there's often like a young elite political hotshot who's been weaned off of many years of rhetorical you know, these students have had sophists that their parents pay a lot of money to get them to learn from, so that they can excel in the art of persuasion and go into politics. And you know, the character of Socrates is often trying to help the kid realize what he doesn't know, so that, I mean, kids have a lot of potential to do a lot of good, but at the same time, they got a lot of fiery passions, not a lot of experience. And if they just go and apply what they've been given as powers of persuasion, talented young people, you know, have a lot of creativity, then they'll do a lot of damage. They'll be used by forces of evil, even, that are in the midst of corrupting or creating wars between Athens and, let's say, Sparta or other neighboring states around Athens that were formerly allies to Athens. They were formerly all working together to stop the Persian Empire. Great, you know, and these little idiots around Pericles' time were all being induced to become agents, even without them knowing it, of higher powers that were causing Athens to destroy its best heritage. So Socrates said, until you know yourself, you go into, like you just said, your own mind's eye, and you start situating your identity not in the pleasures of your flesh, like, or how much pleasure you can gain in life, and then how much pain you could avoid, how much pleasure you could gain. Get out of that formula. Situate your identity in the pleasures of the spirit, of the joy of discoveries, of teaching others, helping others. Those are transcendental joys, and those satisfactions are incommensurable with the lower, you know, people will suffer physically for the preservation of the health of their souls, if that's where they recognize their identity. And then you could trust somebody to have wisdom and to go off into politics if they attain that level. Then you want those people to be the philosopher kings who can break society out of the cage, out of the cave.
And that sounds like Henry VII, who was very much a wise a leader. And so would you say, and it sounds, you know, I'll let you speak to this, because I hear a lot of people say, well, everybody's ideological, but you take someone like Henry VII and you got someone who, he was very humanistic. Like he exuded these human qualities, but those qualities in and of themselves aren't ideological.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I think the thing with Henry VII, and I originally, just as a quick disclaimer or whatever, I originally came to this approach, this method of thinking about Henry VII, and I'm really happy that he resonates with you too, and Plato and many others, was through some years ago. I read some of the older studies conducted by a late American thinker, an economist named Lyndon LaRouche, whose ideas are very rich, especially if you go back to the 80s, a lot of the 1990s writings, especially a lot of rich meaty ideas with all sorts of leads to explore. Really interesting stuff. But Henry VII, exactly. I mean, he really stands out amongst all of the monarchs before that time. He was somebody who saw himself, and I think his advisors played a very big role in that. He had some very good advisors like Thomas More. Erasmus came into that certainly late in the game. A lot of other great Platonic humanists were around him. And it was a world that had just emerged out of a dark age. There was a lot of evil, just like in Plato's day, there was a lot of evil geopolitical forces. At the time, it was not yet the British Empire. England was still considering itself a commonwealth. And he was the first person to say, okay, I see myself as a king, not as being a lord over the slaves who were born inferior to me, which is what most kings were contaminated by thinking, this elitism of a royal bloodline. But he rather saw himself, as the best kings have in history, they're very few, but they're there, as being an instrument of God's will. And it's like, if I'm an instrument, then I have to do the greatest good for the other creatures that were created by God. That's how he saw his relationship to laws, to the people, and also to the evil nests of Venetian financiers who were always trying to pull and enmesh England into wars and return it back to the Richard III, Richard II operations of the Plantagenets that had really ravaged in never-ending wars England and a lot of Europe for a very long time. And unfortunately, Henry VIII didn't have the aptitudes of his father. I think we have certain Venetian agents within his own, certain flatterers within his entourage who were able to bring out the worst passions in the young boy, which resulted in him cutting off the head of really good advisors like Thomas More. Yeah.
And back to Plato. I mean, I love the allegory of the cave. I use it all the time. I used it this week, because I like beating my head against the wall. And so I tend to take on science, because look, there's as much evidence for abiogenesis, which is sort of the core underlying belief behind science or underneath science. There's as much evidence for that as there is in the Easter Bunny. Like, it's just not a tenable theory at all. There's nothing, and we've known for 50, 60, 70 years that the major, the primary building blocks to life are lipids, self-replicating molecules, and amino acids, and yet we've never been able to create life in a test tube. The evidence does not look good for that, and yet I can kind of destroy scientific materialism, in a debate style format. I take on, ultimate frisbee, different isms, and I tend to. I mean, when you look, it might not be very easy for people to see themselves as an ideologue. An ideologue just being someone who adheres to a specific ideology, but it's easy to see it in others. If you try to talk to somebody and there's a brick wall there, usually it's an ideologue. So I take on Christians, and I was using the Plato's cave juxtaposed over the crucifixion of Christ, and it was a brilliant. And I took this person to that paradox, and unfortunately, the one of the two paths they didn't go into the wait a second, this, I need to rethink this. They went off in a rage. But I do think, so I look at, what are the big questions in life, right? Is there life after death? Is there a God? What was there before the Big Bang? All these kinds of things. Are the Warriors going to trade wise men and their draft picks for, all these big questions? And so what I tend to do is coalesce all the different wisdom traditions and look at Buddha and Krishna and Socrates, because I think Socrates was an enlightened master, in that when I look at it in that context of all these different, and I look at Noti Seotan, which was his basic primary marching orders, know thyself. Self-realization is the same thing as what Buddha taught as moksha or liberation. Krishna taught nirvana and enlightenment. In ancient Hebrew, there's this word or, it's pronounced or, that literally means to become light. In Islam, we talk about attaining the station of Abraham. In Christianity, there's redemption and salvation, which on the surface separately doesn't sound like it fits, but in the context of all of those, it fits nicely. And I like to look at, when we look at the relationship between human consciousness and our perceived reality, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you can fit all the different theories and paradigms of model and that relationship into three different buckets, scientific, or just materialism, which says that the brain produces consciousness. Panpsychism, which says that consciousness is some sort of intrinsic property to the universe and seems to interoperate with our nervous system to provide us all with the qualia, with the different experiences we have in perceiving, our life. And then there's idealism, which says that the entire universe is an epiphenomena of some consciousness beyond space and time. So noti seotan is seeing the self as the self through the self, which is what Buddha taught. Go sit under that tree, close your eyes, and observe your breath, or what Jesus taught. So using the allegory of the cave with Christianity is fascinating, because ultimately Plato concluded that when someone exits the cave, which I see as enlightenment, whatever the hell enlightenment is, that when someone exits the cave and they come back and try to free the other inmates, Plato concluded that they will always try to kill that person out of fear that they're going to try to drag them out of the cave. Which is exactly what they did with Jesus.
And that's what they did with Socrates too, right?
Exactly, with the hemlock.
Demos who voted democratically that Socrates was corrupting the minds of the youth, and he should drink the hemlock and die.
Right. And the vote, it was a huge jury. It wasn't 12 jurors of his peers. People, yeah. Right. And it was like a 49% to 51% vote, right? Something like that.
Yeah, and he had a choice. He had a chance, right? In the Credo dialogue after the apology, his friend Credo, who's a rich man, loves, really respects him, has bribed the guards, has arranged for an escape to a friendly city. And Socrates could take it. But Socrates, in the course of this dialogue, followed up with the Phaedo dialogue on the immortality of the soul with his disciples. He really makes the point why he's choosing it. That the best of all possible paths available is actually to stay and receive the hemlock. And he makes the point that, he would not be willing to sacrifice. A friend of mine had brought this to my attention once, because I was always confused, like, why didn't he just run? He could have had another 10 years of writing and helping people, but it's like, no, he didn't want to sacrifice the immortality of his soul to preserve the mortality of his body a little bit longer. There was something of a higher value there. And I think Christ had a very similar chance as well. He had many chances to avoid the torturous punishment that he received. And it's there's, again, going back to the idea of isms and formula, when you relate to Christ's life and story and example and death, there's different mindsets going into it. Somebody, I think, who would suffer from one of these isms would not put the value where it should be, which is that Christ chose, on the one hand, that we're best to do like Socrates, that he really did love people, he loved humanity, that he's willing to die for us. That's a powerful idea, that somebody loved me enough to die for me, despite all of my flaws. That's a powerful concept for one's heart. But number two, when he was asked a little bit earlier on, what's the most important of the 10 commandments? And it was a trick question. I loved his answer, but that's the gateway out of the cave. His answer was not one of the 10. He said, love God and love your neighbor like yourself. There were two positive. Yeah. The commandments were all mostly negations and, behavioral good things to do or not do, but mostly not do. Don't kill, don't steal, don't adulter. But love God, love your neighbor. These are two positive initiatives, which if you can actually do that, everything else you are going to be a much more powerful human being in every decision you make in life. If you actually do that, you'll be more genuine, you'll be more effective, you'll be more creative, and you'll be more happy as well, despite the pains your body might suffer. And I think when you look at examples like Martin Luther King Jr., there's a reason why I listened to his sermons, and they're gorgeous. And to be reminded that in the audience, to listening to a lot of his speeches wasn't just Christians. It was, I mean, you had Catholics, you had Protestants of all denominations, but you had Jews, you had Muslims, you had atheists, but they were all resonating to this higher universality, and that's the emphasis he would always put when he would showcase or talk about the various gospels, the stories, the lessons to be gleaned out of the stories of the New Testament. He was tapping into something much more universal and non-dogmatic, non-ideological, whereas people on a lower level might say, oh, it's all well and good that you're like fighting to defend humanity, and you seem to love people and you seem to love God and all, but did you make Jesus Christ your personal Lord and Savior?
Well, that's it.
You're gonna burn in hellfire.
That's it. Like, I mean, you could just, you're reading my mind as you're talking. There's nothing ideological about that. There's nothing ideological as love your neighbor as thyself. Yeah. These are very humanistic qualities. And we see right now in society, unfortunately, the weaponization of ideologies, where people are really being stretched to believe certain things. And it's history repeats itself. I mean, way more than I do in terms of the last 400 or 500 years, all the players and the puppet masters who have been using people's ideologies for their own needs. So I'm kind of, I think you and I, whatever speech we would watch, I don't know. I mean, it's just been my whole life. When someone says something ideological, just automatically, no, just by principle. Like when someone says, this is how it is, but you don't, out of Martin Luther King, you don't get that listening to his speeches. The mind is let to listen, because it's not, the intellect isn't constantly struggling of bullshit. That's not right.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not didactic, which is also why Plato is enjoyable for those who are sensitive to it, because he's not telling you the way things are in a crystallized way. He's getting your mind to move. You can see that 2,500 years ago, he's been dead physically for a long time, but he really cares about you when he's helping you reproduce the natural organic steps his mind took. Every generation, even 1,000,000 years from now, people will read this and be able to reproduce those same experiences of eurekas that he's bringing you to on your own terms, just by helping you figure out how do you learn to pose the right questions, not so much get the right answers, but how do you generate a power of an improvable power of posing better quality questions. And that's the path to wisdom, right? To sniff out, to develop an instinct for where is the irony? Where is the paradox going to be located? How do I zero in on that? And how do I triangulate that based on several different or many variables at the same time? Because oftentimes the thing that I'm hunting for, that nugget that I'm chasing in the hunt for wisdom, is not something that's going to be perceptible by my senses. So how do I see it with my mind's eye? And he's giving you those skill sets. Whereas, let's say, for example, Aristotle, who comes after Plato, will always give you, and this is why a lot of people like Aristotle more than Plato, but he gives you crystallized answers, and they feel satisfied that, okay, that's justice. It's what he says there on these 3 pages of the Nicomachean Ethics. And there's one justice for the slave, and one justice for the master, and one justice for the husband, and one justice for the kid. And that's justice. Okay, I see, or whatever else, And it's like, no, he doesn't care about your mind. He's not helping you pose the question properly, or the paradox. And I was just thinking, actually, one thing as I'm talking, there's a really great example of Sun Yat-sen, proper pronunciation, the first president of China, the revolutionary, who has this great, in his 3 principles lectures that he publishes before he dies, he's going through Marxism. And because Marxism is starting to spread among a lot of the young talented.
What year is this?
1924, he dies. He's publishing, these lectures occur between 1922 to 24. He dies of liver poisoning, unfortunately, or something. But he, this point, especially after 1919, there's an infusion of Marxist thought. And Sun Yat-sen, he's a follower of Lincoln. He studied in the United States. He studied the American system, and that's outlined concretely in his program for what the government of China should be after we overthrow the dynastic system, which they did in 1911. Keeping in mind, Sun Yat-sen is both a Confucian and a Christian, and he's very Socratic. And he makes the point
to me, there's no contradiction there at all. But sorry to interrupt, but I call myself a Christian, but most Christians say, well, wait, you don't believe this, you don't believe that, you don't believe this, you don't believe that, you can't be a Christian. It's like, what? Jesus wasn't an ideologue. Don't impose your ideology on me. That's like, that's the Plato question. Like there, Jesus was not an ideologue.
Yes.
The Nicene Creed is pure ideology. Reconcile those two things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. It's just look at the spirit more than the crystallized formula of it all, and you'll get it. That's the point of it.
So I interrupted you horribly there.
No, it's fine. Yeah, just to say that, like, the thing about this guy is he put it into action. He lived a life inspired by Christ and Confucius, who both of whom, by the way, lived devoted to creating a better age on earth. I mean, Confucius was trying to create a philosopher king. We often forget he's not just an ivory tower thinker. He was going out trying to create, like Plato, a real philosopher king in real time to break China, in his case, free of its own factionalizations. But so Sun Yat-sen, he organized the revolution, and now he's trying to intervene on the spread of this toxic Marxism throughout a lot of the young elites that are really adopting this. There's reasons for that. And one of the polemics he gets at is he zeroes in on the class struggle in his 3 principles of the people. And he's like, well, yes, there are truthful diagnostics that Marx delivers on the problems of imperialism. They're fine diagnostics of what's wrong, but his assumptions, one, he offers no real workable solutions. Number 2, his assumption of a perpetual class struggle as like an invariant in all of human existence forever. That's something which there's no evidence for that there. And he does believe, like Lincoln, that there's a harmony. You could achieve a harmony of interests of the various groupings. And he says, and he proves that. He goes through how you can get a harmony of various interests of the so-called, bourgeoisie and the proletariat, all these things, by doing things in a moral way defined around the general good through big infrastructure, which he outlines in his 1919 International Development of China program. But he says, like, Marx can thus be maybe said to be a social, not a social psychiatrist. He could be an expert in social neuroses because he can identify the neurotic disorders of human society pretty well, but he can't be considered a social psychologist. He can't identify, well, what is a natural healthy state of being for an individual or for a society. And so that's just a nice little, that's a founding father. He's considered, like, Sun Yat-sen is a sacred character in a sense sacred is maybe a big tough word, but he's a major character who's respected devoutly by all Chinese, whether in Taiwan or whether in China. And he doesn't fit into any of the formulas, any of the isms of what is communism, what is capitalism. He doesn't fit into either extreme. He's something higher. And I think by looking at his way of thinking, how he lived his life, how he organized the revolution, modeled on Lincoln, and the best of the American example, and it added stuff to it as well. You could break free of a lot of these isms in your own life because he was creative.
Yeah. Lincoln made this great speech. I think it was in 1859. That's almost, verbatim of what you're saying. It's in the same context as Henry VII. And how do you pronounce this guy's name? Sun Yat-sen?
Oh, Sun Yat-sen, yeah.
Oh, that wasn't bad. Do you want to speak a little bit about the Lincoln? You know what I'm talking about? I think it was in the late 1850s, before the Civil War started.
Oh, is that where he's in his debate with Judge Douglas for the elections of 1860? Is that it? Where he's talking about the divine right of kings and
right, exactly.
Okay, and slavery. Yeah, that's right. I mean, Lincoln was very clear. People say, oh, Lincoln actually didn't fight the Civil War to stop slavery. He just wanted to preserve the Union because of a letter taken out of context that Horace Greeley published a little bit later on. Now that's a popular assumption in our society, which has been spread a lot, and a lot of people, I used to believe it too, but you start looking at Lincoln's life, his published writings going back to the 1830s when he's a lawyer in Illinois, then a young congressman with John Quincy Adams. He is consistent his entire life at not only fighting slavery, fighting the deep state of the United States that was even then very powerful, or organized around Wall Street and the city of London. That's not a new thing today. This goes back a long time, and Lincoln is always zeroing in on stopping things like the U.S.-Mexican War, which is an aggressive war that should never have happened. He's against slavery the whole time. He's against international colonialism. He's always against these things, and he sees them as the same thing. So when he became the president, the reason why you could read the dispatches from the Confederate leadership, that was very clear. They all stated very clearly that they saw Lincoln's victory as they understood it to be a direct threat to their own ability to maintain their system of slavery that they premised their entire identities around and economy around before they initiated the first shot at Fort Sumter. But in the speech with Douglas in 1859, it's very clear. Like he states, you know, that the system of international empire, of the divine right of kings, hereditary power that is just your virtue, this idea that your virtues are born with you based upon your genetic stock and what caste you're born into. That is equivalent to the same poison that's brought us now to the point of civil war inside the United States, of the belief in a master and a slave, that your slaves are born that way, and you can inherit, you know, the slave master's children can inherit other human beings. And he's clear that you can't own the liberty of another person. Liberty is a transcend. It's not a material thing. You can't cut liberty. I could cut this cup that exists in space and time. I could break this up and share half a cup with somebody else, but you can't take liberty and cut it up. It doesn't exist in space and time. It's a transcendental. It's a phenomenon of the soul and of the mind. So you can't own something like that. It's, you know, you can give it up. I have free will, so I could choose to give up my liberty to somebody. That's another story, but that's not what's happening to the slaves in the United States. So the whole time, I mean, the war was not only about slavery, it was about also preserving the Union, because he also knew that if the Union dissolves, then slavery will only spread, and you will have inevitable conflict with, I mean, having a slave nation, a slave confederacy under Jefferson Davis right next to a so-called free Northern republic. That would be a ripe, fertile soil for future conflicts to be initiated by the British Empire, who always had their fingers in all baskets, both supporting Wall Street as well as the Confederate South the whole time, you know. And he with his collaborators, and he had a lot of them that I go through in many of my writings, like Henry C. Carey, Ulysses S. Grant carried this forward even after he died, Charles Sumner, William Seward, the Secretary of State, who got stabbed like 20 times the night that Lincoln was assassinated. All of these guys understood that this was a global fight, and that after the victory of the North, they went to work hard in Germany with delegations sent to Japan under the Meiji Restoration, to Russia under Alexander III, who, by the way, did in large measure tipped the balance in favor of Lincoln during the Civil War in 1863, when he sent the Russian naval fleet to preserve the Union as a message to the British and the French imperialists that if you go in openly backing the South, that's a war against Russia, which kept them at bay. So there was a spread now after the war, when people could see the toxic, narcissistic evil of the British in full force. It couldn't keep the veneers of virtue on anymore. It was like naked. They'd just done their opium wars. They'd done the Crimean wars to destroy Russia. They'd invested so much in the American Southern secession movement, the Indian uprisings that they had to suppress over 2 years. It was, millions were killed by the British. Everyone saw this evil, and everyone was very much open now to a new way, a new paradigm, by inviting the Americans, the Lincoln Americans, very different from what we know today, over to help them apply protectionism, development of national banking, national economics, rail and full spectrum in manufacturing was being deployed all over the world for a new type of age of win-win cooperation that was about to blossom. And how did the British deal with that? As they were getting weaker and weaker, tip the chessboard over, initiate a bunch of assassinations, right? Throughout from 1880 to 1905, even 1916, there's just so many assassinations. And then initiate a couple of world wars, right? Just get people to just kill each other ravenously for a few years.
It seems like, I don't know if I'm going out on a limb, but it seems like it's a little exciting just listening to you describe all that on a global stage, and the sort of battle between good and evil is culminating in the present day. we'll see how it plays out. And of course, this is really where I'm most interested in ideologies, because so many people uh, are unable, like you were saying, everything was laid bare by what, 1865 or sometime. Everything was laid bare for everyone to see it for what it is. But right now, everything's been laid bare for 50, 60, 70% of the people to see what it is.
Mm.
But there's a huge block, say 40% of the population, that's so ideologically entrenched. And maybe this is a question for you. I can't put my finger on what is the ideology that prevents them from seeing what everyone else sees.
Oh, that's such a good question, and I don't have a solid answer for that. But I think the solution to that is located a bit more in the domain of aesthetics than in purely ideology, which are connected. It's a dynamic. I see it as a dynamic thing. Our sense of beauty, and this is in Plato's dialogues too. How our sense of judgment is tied to our sense of beauty and ugliness. A lie, one could say, is generally ugly, whereas the truth is always beautiful and should be loved. So love, truth, beauty are it's different aspects of the same thing. That's the
Satchitananda.
Satchitananda is the term for that in
no, Sat is truth, knowledge, and wisdom, or something.
Very connected. Yeah, that's a very connected concept. And that's it. I mean, I think that so when you compare, let's say, Mozart's Requiem, okay, here's a gorgeous, I mean, it's an incredible piece of music, but it's not only gorgeous because the melodies are beautiful and the polyphony is beautiful, but the idea, the development of where it's going, where is Mozart taking your soul, and how does that journey that he wants you to experience, how is that reflected in what his own soul did in overcoming and transforming from a better to a worse state? It's very divine. If it's done with you could listen to it from a lower standpoint. I mean, you could just listen to it to enjoy it too, and that's fine. But if you really get into the spirit of Mozart, it's something much more transcendental. And I think that today the problem that we have is a lot of people are. I was just reading a paper from foreign policy guru is talking about the futuristic. He's a futurist, and he's talking about how Picasso, Da Vinci, Paul McCartney, the Rolling Stones, Mozart, it's all the same thing. They're all beauties in the eye of the beholder. I take issue with that. I think that if you look at what motivates the composers, where their souls were coming from in terms of how they related to God themselves and their fellow man, there was a deeper, higher quality love that animated a Da Vinci or a Mozart or a Beethoven than what we had motivating let's say, a Picasso, who Picasso describes, Arianna Huffington as a quick example. Okay, Arianna Huffington wrote a little biography on Picasso, and she describes how she went into it liking Picasso and wanting to just write about his life. That was her contract, and she was disturbed to read the letters and look at his life and discover that he self-consciously destroyed women around him who he got to love him like a god, then consciously destroyed them, dismantled them, to get them to commit suicide. And I think one or two of his children also, he did this to, and he found his creative juices from that process. And it's like, if that's where you're going, if that's the well that you're drinking from to go and create, then there's something that's poisonous in your creation, which I'm sorry, if you're the people, what will be the effect of that poison in those who come in that society who are trained in, I went to art school. So we were trained in art history and other things to go to the Contemporary and Modern Arts Museum and find virtue in ugliness. And that's where you got good marks. And, at a certain point, I had to drop out from fine arts at a certain point because I was being punished. I was failing for producing works that were intelligible, that I found, and I was doing short animated paintings, animated videos. And the more I tried to communicate a story, a thought that I had, the more the teachers, these were all people who were put in positions because they had a certain ideological bent of the way they thought. They were deconstructionists, right? They all valued the deconstruction of society, and they would punish me for doing that. And I would get rewarded for deconstructing myself and to make my thoughts as unintelligible and abstract as possible. And I knew that there was something wrong with that. I was like, I can't go through this for another 2 years, you know? But so I think that in our current society, we had a culture. Then throughout the 1960s, something happened. Then we had what's called a counterculture. That counterculture created a new aesthetical feel for the majority, not everybody, but a lot of the people growing up in that soil of the 60s, of the 70s, dropping. Oh, there you go. Okay.
I just turned 61. So I was born in 60, and it's been interesting. I'll let you continue, but just as, you know, as the test subject you're talking about, it's fascinating now. And I want you to just tell me what you mean by aesthetics a little bit more, but it's been fascinating to me to see the shift, my personal shift in that regard, and just sort of look back on the last 60 years and say, whoa, you know, yeah, something did happen there. And, you know, we got swung way, you know, a lot of us got swung one direction. And now it's like, well, wait a second, what the hell was that?
Yeah, it's these polarizations, eh? Like, I think that like a lot of the people from my parents' generation, your generation, who were born especially after World War II until like the early 60s, but probably more till 45 to 59, I think, is your typical formula for what defines a baby boomer, right? Because you were coming of age during the 68 period. You might have been a little bit younger for that, and we're watching maybe your older siblings taking the LSD, and, you know, but there was a lot of the Cold War was a bipolar, insane age to grow up in. You know, I've the threat of nuclear holocaust every day, sitting under your, you know, doing drills in school. And
I grew up with nuclear nightmares, and people don't know what those are now. But I must have had 20, 30, 40 in my lifetime where you're literally having a nightmare of, you know, I'm from South Bend, Indiana, and there was a nuclear bomb going off and destroying our city. And our whole generation had these. Everyone had them.
oh my God, yeah, that's such violence that was done to the young people. I mean, first of all right, did the Cold War even need to happen? Well, when you look at Franklin Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, all of the Lincoln Americans who were in positions of power after the defeat of Hitler, or towards the defeat of Hitler, again, thank Wall Street and the City of London, and, you know, for that gift. But coming out of the war, there was an architecture being put into place with the idea of a U.S. Russia China alliance, which were the allies that put down, you know, Japanese fascism was brutal. 10 million Chinese killed, 25 million Russians killed. And there was an understanding that the age post-war had to be defined around internationalizing the best aspects of what FDR did during his battles to regulate Wall Street, break up the banks, but also direct, you know, public credit for the Tennessee Valley Authority, the big infrastructure of the 1930s that Roosevelt geared into creating a lot of jobs. But to do that for Africa now, for South America, they had plans for Brazil, for China, during the Bretton Woods Conference, for India. There were amazingly giant projects that never happened. Why? FDR died, and all of his allies, like Henry Wallace and Harry Dexter White, who created a lot of the Bretton Woods institutions, were all labeled red commie traitors. They were destroyed. Some died under mysterious circumstances. And then a tool, a little George Bush Jr. prototype, Harry Truman, is installed, disbands the OSS, creates the CIA.
What geopolitical event happened 8 weeks before the CIA was created?
You're talking about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was that
no. I think it's geopolitical. Maybe geopolitical is the wrong word, but something happened. Something major happened in July of 47. 8 weeks before
47. Yeah, right. Sorry, I was thinking of
8 weeks before the CIA was created.
It was such a dense period. I wouldn't. What are you gonna say?
Roswell.
Okay.
And 8 weeks in the context of government is a blink of an eye. I mean, it was like the next day they created the CIA.
Well, there was a lot of, one of the things that was going on as well is you had the absorption of a lot of German rocketry scientists, people like Victor Schauberger was
Project Paperclip.
yeah, and a lot of these aerial projects that were being done, there were these brothers, I forgot their name, were already developing saucer technology using certain types of reverse
Yeah.
combustion
No.
programs.
There was a extraterrestrial craft that came
Yeah,
into
that'll be the
Russia.
topic of another conversation we have. All right, actually wrote a paper on this, but let's have that as another conversation.
Yeah,
But
no,
yeah,
I just find it fascinating that the CIA was
yeah,
created as a rogue agency. It had to be a rogue agency in the, hypothetically, as if you assume this is happening, it was created as an extra governmental rogue agency. It
well,
had to be.
what I think for me, the insight that I got the most out of was looking at the battle. My wife actually wrote a paper on the purge of U.S. intelligence after Roosevelt died, and there was a real systematic purge because a lot of the people in the OSS really understood what Lincoln was talking about, the nature and role of colonialism, of these major financiers behind the rise of fascism. They understood it. There was a anyway, and they were purged. And only those who were uh, allied to the new Anglo-American system of global government were kept in and given positions of more clout under Allen Dulles and before that John Foster. And I mean things like like the entire Galen apparatus of Hitler's top intelligence guy and his whole network were put back into power in 47 as well, or 49, under Dulles's watch in West Germany, and beyond, right? So you had, we're talking about what was this aesthetical thing, and I think looking at the trauma of that insane period of also covert operations, mass assassinations, the re-extension of the British Empire, which FDR wanted to dismantle. There's documented accounts of Roosevelt's intention to dismantle the British, not to create an American empire, but to rather extend full spectrum development the way Lincoln's allies wanted to do not that long earlier to other nations, so that everyone could stand on their own 2 feet and not just be addicted to whatever the credit lines given by a financial leviathan, a unipolar thing.
Now China's taken their place, and they've got
China's increasingly, ironically, acting more American in that sense than Americans are. Yeah, and that's
right.
an amazing irony for me. So all that to say that what happened to the young people going through this process of seeing the contradictions, the ugly lies of their, the belief, the naive belief in national patriotism of America, within the context of the reality of this ugly Cold War, wars in Vietnam, friends coming home in body bags and brothers and sisters, and it was all insane. And then assassinations of great leaders in every fucking 2 seconds. It broke it broke people so that they became susceptible to the opposite extreme of what's called, again, the counterculture of starting to hate you started basically throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so that all of a sudden it became easy to believe that all America is a hypocrisy. There's nothing good, and you got a lot of hate because people would extrapolate the evil of their local time into all of the history of the world, and they'd say, oh, all white dead European males are all colonial slave owners. So why study Latin, Greek, or Dante? It's all racist hypocrites. We need now a new type of education system founded upon relevant thinkers in the modern time that could express the ugliness of the world we live in. So you had like Sartre and a lot of things like that were infused, and a lot of ugly ideas that were based upon a deep misanthropy, a hate for human beings. Nietzsche, there's a very deep misanthropy in Nietzsche's worldview, which became infused in a lot of the school systems. And
Huxley.
I think with Huxley, big time. Yeah. Huxley's like the anti-Shakespeare. And they all, I think, when you are saturated with Brave New World and stories like Lord of the Flies and 1984 and other things, and you start watching movies like Soylent Green, because the film is part of what shapes our aesthetical taste as a zeitgeist. And you had Soylent Green, Planet of the Apes, like all of this stuff is coming through, right? The Network. and they all have bits of truth, you know, they're all
Of
like
course.
echoing.
Well, that's what makes them so powerful.
Yeah, but I think from there it becomes emotionally hard to acknowledge that maybe there's something beautiful in the U.S. Revolution, in the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution, and the sacrifices of the people in the Civil War. And they can't see it anymore because the emotion of disgust is so great that it turns the mind off of any possibility of that emotion being threatened. And there's a comfort in that.
That's what's happening right now. That's exactly, I think that's, and if you can put an ideological name on that, you can patent it, trademark it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I've got my golf buddy, you know, he's 75, so he's in the age, you know, that you're talking about, post World War II to now. And we had this conversation the other day because he's one of these people who can't see what everyone else can see, and he's got his blinders on. He's like, Frank, you know, we grew up with this. We killed our president. We killed his brother. We killed this civil rights leader. You know, blah blah blah. I never trusted the media, and I didn't trust politicians, and da da da. But right now, in this time of my life, I don't have any time to do the research that you're doing. So I'm just going to accept whatever the media is telling me.
Ooh, ouch.
I mean, I'm paraphrasing, you know, but it's just sort of like, well, maybe you should recuse yourself from voting then. I mean, our entire self-government system is predicated on, I don't know who it was, Madison or Jefferson actually wanted to stipulate something in the Constitution that there were certain qualifiers. It wasn't everybody can vote. They wanted people like who were engaged and informed could vote, of course. But it was just odd. It's like, but I think you really hit the nail on the head there. Their disgust is so deep, and the ideology, or the people who've weaponized this ideology, have taken that disgust and personified it in this orange man. And that orange man has just been the target of all their disgust, and they're so disgusted with that they can't see anything else.
No, and they're inoculated against beauty. Like there's so much beautiful sacrifices and beautiful ideas shaping our history, our fight for emancipation as a species against empire and those who seek to enslave. And that goes back, you'll find shining lights and rays of beautiful souls who are imperfect. They're not angels, but they really, I mean, there's so much to feed the soul off of. But if you are really enmeshed in this aesthetical cultural matrix of cynicism that has deeply misanthropic cynicism rooted inside of it, you're inoculated. You can't see it. You're always assuming that there's something evil or whatever, or hypocritical lurking behind the surface or whatever. Everybody's out to do things for their own different agenda. So it on the one hand, why is it comfortable? I think it's comfortable partially because it absolves you of any moral obligation to do anything. Yeah,
Stanford experiment.
The Stanford experiment. Are you talking about MK Ultra here or what?
Stanford experiment, I mean, it was shocking, the results, but the Stanford experiment was in the early 60s, I believe. And they were trying to figure out what the fuck happened in Germany. How could these people, you know, do it? Not just the upperlings, but just everybody.
Oh, so is that the pain experiment where
that's the pain? Yeah, it's called the Stanford experiment, but it's the same thing. They were able to absolve themselves of their participation in this because they were just following orders, or they disassociated themselves from their actions. But when you said that absolving themselves, that's like Stanford experiment.
No, absolutely. And it's ironically, even though we see it manifest in one hand with people who have suffered from rabid radical existentialism and nihilism that they've just been saturated in for so long, and they have that they express this in one way, but then also you get this in the Christian fundy or other fundy extreme or what seems to be different, right? Because they believe devoutly in faith, in religion, but you'll have people, who will respond to the idea that maybe we should do something morally to change the direction of this society. Maybe we should read and study the past a little bit more seriously to empower ourselves. And their response will often be, no, it's all ordained in the Bible. It's all forecast. Armageddon is something you can't avoid. It's, if you actually try, you're going against God's will anyway. So the best you could do is make Jesus Christ your personal Lord and Savior, and wait for the rapture. And ultimately, they're avoiding their own personal responsibility, which, as creatures made in the image of the divine, of God, which is, I think, a moral force, we only find our happiness by awakening, going outside of our skin and our comfort zones, and doing good for our future selves, for our children, for our neighbors. That's how you sort of find how you are, as a finite particle contained in space and time with a birth and a death. You're part of a higher continuity as well, which is even more important than your mortal flesh, your mortal coil. And that's again why I said, like, Socrates' whole argument in the Credo and in the Phaedo dialogue, people want to treat themselves, take a few hours and read the Phaedo on the immortality of the soul. And he's taking you through step by step how we could understand or come to an idea of the nature, the essence of, is there a soul, or are we just flesh and impulses? If there is a soul, is it also finite as the body is? How do we prove it? How do we test it out? Is it immortal, or, and he's like taking you through these exercises. And ultimately you could see that everybody is sad around him except for him. And there's a reason for that, It's not that he's stupid or foolish.
It's funny. A lot of cave dwellers, Christian cave dwellers, and you know what I mean by cave dwellers. There's Plato's cave. They're just ideologically staring at the shadows on the wall, which is just a crucifix, I guess. Well, they look at Plato and Socrates as, well, they're just philosophers, and there's nothing. They're not about divinity, and they're just about logic and reasoning, and it's completely the opposite.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I mean, they just use reasoning, like you were saying, and logic to sort of disprove the materialistic viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. And you see that with really strong Christians, like Martin Luther King Jr. Again, you read his sermons, or you listen to his sermons, even better, whether it's his famous From the Mountaintop sermon the day before he dies, and he's very clear. You could see that he understands the conditions that he's been threatened that morning, that he would like to live a long life. And then he talks about those who have lived without a cause and live without adherence to their conscience, who might live a long life till the age of 90 or older, but they've died when they were 30. They're just body at that point. And he says, I may not get there with you, but I've seen the mountaintop. I've been to the promised land. And he is, again, talking to a full spectrum audience of people, and just tapping into the best part of themselves. Or even in, his different sermons where he talks about the arc of justice, how it's long, but it's bent towards, or the arc of history is long, but bent towards justice. And he talks about how, whether he could be born in the time of Socrates or Egypt, or, the Renaissance, which time in history would he like to be born into more than the current shitty time of the Vietnam War and nuclear annihilation and all this stuff. And he's like, it's a messed up time we're living in, and he goes through an appreciation for of Socrates and Eratosthenes and Plato so he's going through an appreciation for all of these different truth seekers of the past, but still, despite that, saying it's because of my relationship to their souls that I want to be in the world that I am in right now the most, so that I could do the greatest good and express their sacrifice in my world, in my time, the best possible way. And he is talking to the future as well, because again, he knows he's probably not going to live that long. But again, he's tapped into the eternal sort of higher wave of existence as a particle, right? So he's tapped into that continuity, where you can read these speeches 100,000 years in the future, when we're an intergalactic civilization, students can listen to this and still be awoken to that higher part of themselves, whatever that world might look like. So yeah, I think that finite, infinite, mortal, immortal coexistence, that ironical juxtaposition is beautiful. People who deny that, they tend to lack a certain aesthetical, they haven't listened to Mozart's Requiem. Again, listen to Mozart's Requiem. Google it right now. Go on YouTube. No, maybe not right now.
I have
conversation.
I have it behind me. I'll put it
Yeah,
on
yeah, I
the
was talking to your audience. So
Oh,
people listening, finish this video, and then afterwards listen to Mozart's Requiem on YouTube, and just take in the immortality. Just take it in, you know, you'll find it. It's a
um,
And a lot of people can't enjoy that. A lot of people are, sorry, just last thought. A lot of people are not able to enjoy that. If they've been really saturated in, for example, atonalism in music, which is just random hitting of the keys, which is what they do for the music students, whereas for the art students, like I was, it's abstract, reductionism. But it's the same thing for those who are saturated in that, who have to tune their inner selves to excel in that type of world or pay homage or respect to the ugly. You can expose them to as many Rembrandts or Da Vinci's or Mozart pieces as you want. Nothing won't break through. It's just like, oh, that's kind of obsolete. It's very Baroque. It's very very romantic or whatever. It's some elitist thing that they'll say, but they just.
So let me ask you a question, Matthew. You're a bit of an enigma in the sense that it would be very easy to be depressed and dejected and almost despondent with your wealth of knowledge over the last several hundred years with what's going on currently all around the globe. You're an incredibly upbeat guy. That's how you come across. I guess that was a question. It's like, you seem very optimistic and positive about what's happening right now. That's what you seem to exude that.
Oh, well, thanks, man. I mean, I try not to let my sorrow. I mean, I'm a melancholy person. My wife will tell you that sometimes, but I try to generally, and luckily I have a great partner. My wife Cynthia is also a writer. I'm able to share in a lot of my experiences with her as well, with the Rising Tide Foundation that we co-founded. And I think that we both strive to feed off of. I wouldn't be able to write politically. I know that if I didn't strive to feed off of something more eternal in my recreational time, like great conversations with friends, but also great music. I try to study classical painting with a friend of mine who's building an observatory. So I try to find a way to feed those sorts of pleasures to remind myself that ultimately behind all of the ugliness that my senses are showing me of how stupid and ugly human beings tend to behave right now, this is not their nature. There's a higher, beautiful nature that they're being deprived of. And that lets you kind of laugh at a little bit or find the ironies of like why these different people who are like, everybody's, born as a baby, as a creature made in the image of God with these divine, beautiful attributes. And they don't know it. They don't know what their conscience is, right? It's been deprived of them. So they're acting like fools, contrary to their own happiness. And
so let me interrupt a little bit. Okay, a lot. So I've mentioned postmodern science a couple of times, and I want to clarify what I mean by that. It's not a deconstructionist meme. Modern science is around 500 years old, 480, I guess. It's considered to have started in 1543 when books by Vesalius and Copernicus were written about the human anatomy and the solar system, respectively. And Galileo Galilei, he is considered the father of modern science. And so again, these modern science is nearly 500 years old. And we went through Sir Francis Bacon and John Locke, and philosophers started to get more and more involved. And in the 1840s, science changed so dramatically, so radically with the introduction of scientific materialism and hypothetico-deductivism that it warrants a new brand. You can't just continue calling it modern science because it's radically different from what it had been prior to that. In the late stages of that, we had Lamarck with Lamarckism, and a lot of the people in the 1600s and 1700s were vitalists who believed that there was this invisible, immeasurable life force energy, which turns out probably actually is the correct model. The more we look at research into human consciousness versus the materialistic model, which quantum mechanics should have destroyed, but it didn't, because the entrenched ideologies kind of kept it there, but that needs to be abolished. But with this advent of what I call postmodern science in the 1840s, which is the same decade that Frederick, who's Marx's buddy, they were
Engels.
Right, Engels and Marx wrote in the same decade that we got scientific materialism and hypothetical deductivism. We also got Engels and Marx from their book in the 1840s. So it deserves the last 180 years in science. And I've heard the number one argument against this is, well, Frank, look at how great science has been. Look at the cell phones and the CRISPR technology and COVID. Whoops. Maybe we wouldn't be using CRISPR to put HIV strains inside of a bat virus and create science robbed humanity of our soul collectively by making the postmodern science of the 1840s a form of institutionalized atheism. And so when I look at the fabric of society right now, I see the aftermath of that, because science is underneath almost everything in society. You can call it the new Pope. It replaced the ideology of Catholicism and all the Protestant religions strains with this new authority in society.
Yeah.
And maybe having that authority being atheistic is not such a good idea, because it affects everything. And so you look at the breakdown of society, and you can just say, God, atheism, maybe it shouldn't be atheism. Critical race theory, if you take atheism out of that, and you can just on and on and on and on it goes. So that all said, I'm a huge, all my videos, all my films, all my life, I'm an enormous proponent of meditation. I want everybody to meditate. It's a way of when you disable the sensory input from your five senses, you're able to turn off the monkey mind. What are you left with?
When experience, I guess.
Just yourself. Just okay. You have you're in a state of non-thinking awareness,
unfiltered existence.
Unfiltered existence. The sensory input, you're not hearing anything, feeling, touching, smelling, hearing, and your monkey mind is shut down. And in that state, everything else dissolves, and you experience yourself as you are. And so that's really what drives me to do everything. I think we need to somehow figure out how to break the logjam in science and remove this. It is a scientific materialism that makes it ideological. It's hypothetical deductivism, which puts a firewall, and it says, for example, I look based on all my research, the best explanation for the evolutionary process is that reincarnation is the major driving force behind all evolutionary biology. It's the most elegant solution. If you look at my film Beyond Me, it makes a very strong case for this to be the correct model. But scientists will say, well, we can't test that. That's not falsifiable. We can't test that for falseness. So therefore, it's not scientific. So we're gonna settle for this scientific materialism and random selection and mutations, which is all bullshit, because of the firewall that we've installed that doesn't allow us to actually consider this to be something that's beyond space and time, something that's transcendental.
Exactly.
And so ideologically, if we can rip hypothetical deductivism, some people call it Popperism for Karl Popper, but this idea that if we can't falsify, if we can't create testable predictions from a scientific hypothesis, then it's not scientific. That's the ideology that we need to rip out.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the thing with Popper is a great example of just the sickness, because like by extending What did he do? What was his innovation beyond the open society thing and creating George Soros's, or as a disciple? What was his big innovation or contribution to human thought? Was it a discovery of anything? No, he never made a discovery of anything. He had a novel, I guess, quasi-novel approach to ideas and how they evolve by taking radical Darwinism and applying it to thought, and just by saying that thought is the evolution of human thought is not premised around discoveries or eurekas. That's not it. It's by, he says, the guy who never discovers anything, that it's all by disproving previous thoughts, that the weak thoughts are filtered out, that are not fit to survive, and the better thoughts procreate. They're not true thoughts. They're just better at procreating.
Survival of the fittest.
Exactly. It's all by negation. And there's nothing real in his world. It doesn't exist. So that's why he was also, loved by the Fabian Society of London as well. And that's why he goes and creates synthetic personalities like this Hungarian sociopath, right? Speculator. So I think that locating, again, in the learning how to think from the mind's eye and seeing these different complexes of ideas that are rooted in certain core assumptions and axioms that then filter through implicitly, if not always explicitly, to every single branch, which will be either contaminated with the poison of that assumption or infused with vitality and goodness by the legitimacy of the root. And like one of the things that gave birth, what was it that gave birth to the great Renaissance burst in science and discoveries, was the idea, the rediscovery of ancient Greek thought that was reborn. It was a rebirth of the best of ancient Greek thought, that people were studying all of a sudden Plato again. They were studying Homer. They were actually like reviving this way of thinking that dealt with how we as finite minds or beings relate to the infinite causality, the divine, right? And how do we leap into the unknown? How do we have the faith and the technique that we can develop to responsibly make better quality leaps into new hypotheses that generate solution concepts to problems? And it has application in every domain of existence. That's why Da Vinci they call it a Renaissance man. Like, he wasn't a specialist in one thing, because he discovered that universal characteristic of reciprocal action of his personal self, right, with God's mind. And he saw all of creation and the laws of creation from the standpoint of, well, if there's laws, there's a creator of laws, there's a lawmaker. What's the unifying principle organizing the different laws? And the materialists who came after, really, they infested a lot during the Enlightenment, but really took over in the 20th century. A lot of them were based on the idea that no. Just use your data, use your senses, build a model, explain it away. You don't need to have a hypothesis of the infinite or anything. You don't need that. And that curtailed a lot of the progress in science that was exploding onto the scene in the 15th, 14th, 15th centuries. That then took a very
even the 16th,
even into the
17th. I mean, Newton was, there's a lot of Bacon, so it goes up into the 1700s. And that's what they generally consider the Enlightenment, which is the opposite of Enlightenment.
I mean, it's this whole, again, formula thinking, right? If you want either your senses on one extreme of the, they said you have a choice. You could use the a priori method or the a posteriori method, but pick one, or maybe do a little mix of the both. If you're an a priorist, it means that you have to start with rules and assumptions about reality, and then you're going to use the blind faith in those unproven rules and assumptions, whether it's Euclid or Ptolemy or whatever, and you're going to use those rules to help you navigate and fit the data you can collect into some coherent model. And then the other school would say no, like the Baconians, or they would be like, no, it's a posteriori. We take senses, we look for patterns, we extrapolate into a universal, and we do the opposite. And some people would do a synthesis of the both. But it's like, if you look at the greatest minds who made these incredible paradigm shifting leaps into discovery concepts, like Da Vinci, or you look at Kepler or Leibniz, or any of the people who discovered really big things, right? They're not limiting themselves to either one or even mixing alone. They're using the best of both, but they're doing something more. And it's not located anywhere in any of the
isms.
Yeah, it's not there. It's somewhere else.
No, it's not. Yeah. I have this theory that all ideologies, the root of them is always poison.
If it's a blind faith, yeah, I mean, I think that the worst ideology, because it's ideas about ideas, right? And if you believe ideologically that that um that your thoughts can never, that no truth exists, okay? Like a lot of people suffer from this. They ideologically believe that no matter what exertions they do in the time in their life, they're ultimately not going to come to any truth. So what exactly are you doing when you're calling yourself a scientist and you're trying to do things and go into the unknown? What are you pursuing if you don't believe in truth? It's really just a model to what? Manipulate others?
Get published?
Get published? Do something for, yeah, get money for yourself? What do you want to do? Whereas the faith, right? The best scientists have faith that the unknown is still there's a coherence between their mind and the mind of the unlimited creation, the cause of the laws that are invisible. So that you have to have there's this coherence of the objective and the subjective self that's possible, but you have to feel it as well. You can't just think it and make it happen either. It's a bit of the both, you know? And again, Socrates does it well. If you look at his Timaeus, his Theaetetus dialogue, especially on the issue of how our minds relate to the eternal processes of whether it's justice or geometry or science, that he all sees as different sides of the same thing, and they are, I think it's provable. He's again taking you through a method to make those discoveries. Ben Franklin does it as well with his discoveries into electricity, that he understands as part of the same process that he's a part of in the 1750s, 60s, preparing the groundwork for what becomes the new type of society in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, that he is the major initiator for the whole time. You can't look at his discoveries in science or his discoveries in the industrial technological innovation application of those discoveries, because he invented a lot of things too and encouraged others to make inventions to help society, to alleviate us from our burdens. And with his political revolution, it's all different parts of the same thing, and they are the same thing.
They are. And what are all the great inventions and innovations that came out of Stalin's USSR or Mao's Cultural Revolution?
I mean, that's a whole other can of worms, right? Yeah, it's actually a topic for another thing. But yeah, okay. I mean, you could. Yeah, there's.
Well, listen, I want to wrap this up. It's been 90 minutes, which is going to be long for some people to sit through. It's been fascinating. I hope some people have gotten something out of this. I'm curious as to, and maybe this is a different topic, but or for a different time, but just sort of your, what's the remediation, because everything's, the isms have created a schizophrenic society, and how do we, maybe that's just a rhetorical question. How do we heal this? How do you use the Socratic method on 7 billion people and say, hey, here's a paradox, figure it out?
That is definitely something worth pondering. Yes.
Listen, if anybody wants to ask me questions or suggest a guest, it's DogsAndBaskets@gmail.com. You want to give your contact info or websites or any information on how people could get in touch with you?
Yes, they can go to risingtidefoundation.net or canadianpatriot.org. If they want to take part in weekly lectures that I curate with my wife every Sunday afternoon, we do those usually at 4 p.m. Tonight it will be actually at 7 on Pan-Africanism, which this will already have happened by the time people listen to this. But that they can reach me at info@risingtidefoundation.net. And usually we request a donation for people to take part. But if you don't have the money, it's fine too. You'll get a free Zoom link every week. Just send again your email to that email I just said, and that's it.
Excellent. Well, this has been phenomenal. I hope some people got something out of this, because I thought it was great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
See you, Frank. Buddy. Yes, Bye. Sir.